spent 6 years strapping torn-up kids into the back of a medevac Black Hawk, my hands inside their wounds at 400 feet over Helmand. And not once did I think the place I'd come closest to dying would be the dirt floor of my own father's barn, with my baby sister standing in the doorway telling her husband to hurry up and finish me. My name is Della Ramsey, Sergeant First Class, retired. I was 31 years old when my brother-in-law cracked 2 of my ribs and split my scalp open against a hitching post. And the last clear thing I heard before everything went to static was my sister's voice. Not screaming, not begging him to stop, calm, bored, almost, the way she used to sound asking me to pass the salt. Just finish it, Royce. She's not signing anything anyway. Before I tell you what happened in that barn and how the whole thing finally turned, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever learned the hard way that the second real money lands on the table, blood can stop meaning a single thing. Hit that like button so I know I'm not talking to an empty room. My father had been dead 9 days. We buried him on a cold morning in late October, under a sky the color of an old nickel, in the little cemetery off the county road where his own father was buried and his father before that. The whole town of Marrow Creek showed up. Ranchers I'd known since I was knee-high stood in the back with their hats off and their faces wet, and old Wade Tillman, who'd been my dad's best friend for 50 years and the county sheriff for 30 of them, gave the eulogy in a voice that kept breaking and kept going anyway. My father, Hollis Ramsey, was a hard man to put into words. He'd been a cavalry scout in his army days, then he came home and spent the next 4 decades building a horse ranch out of nothing on Cottonwood Road. And in his last 15 years, he'd quietly opened the place up to busted-up veterans who needed somewhere to be around animals that didn't ask them anything. He never advertised it, he never took a dime. Men would just show up, and he'd hand them a brush and a horse and let the work do what the doctors couldn't. That was the man we buried. And before the dirt had even settled, my sister wanted to sell the ground he was lying in spitting distance of. She came back to the ranch house after the service with her husband, and the 2 of them changed clothes and came downstairs looking like they were dressed for a business meeting, which I suppose they were. My sister had married up, or thought she had. Her husband was the kind of man who wore a watch worth more than my truck and talked about leveraging assets at the dinner table, and somewhere in the years since their wedding, she'd traded in the girl I used to build hay forts with for a thinner, sharper woman who flinched when she had to touch anything in our father's house, like the grief might get on her good coat. She didn't even sit down. She stood in the middle of Dad's living room, looking at the worn rug and the wood stove and the wall of framed photographs like she was already pricing it for the dumpster. "We need to talk about the property," she said. "Dad's been gone 9 days," I said. "Which is exactly why we need to talk about it now, before it becomes a problem." Her husband eased himself into Dad's chair, the leather one with the cracked arm that nobody else had ever sat in, and crossed his ankle over his knee. "Della, let's be adults. This place is 200 acres of debt and dry grass, the barn roof shot. There's a developer out of Bozeman who'd take the whole parcel tomorrow and we could all walk away clean. You included." "This is his home," I said. "It's not a parcel." My sister actually laughed, just a little breath of it through her nose. "It's dirt and a mortgage, Della. Don't get sentimental on me. Sentiment doesn't pay anything. I want to be honest with you, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I wouldn't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I didn't yell at her. I should have. I just stood there in our father's living room with the casserole dishes the neighbors had brought still cooling on the counter, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold, the way it used to go right before a bird went hot and the wounded started loading. The lawyer settled it, or tried to. 2 days later, Calvin Pruitt, who'd handled my father's affairs for as long as I'd been alive, sat the 3 of us down at the kitchen table and read the will. It was so simple, it was almost funny. Dad left the ranch to me, because he knew I was the only one of his children who'd ever actually wanted it, who'd cried the day I shipped out because I thought I might never smell that hayloft again. But he didn't cut my sister out. The will said I had to pay her half the appraised value of the land within 7 years. He'd done the math so it could be done. He'd tried, even in death, to be fair to both his girls. My sister's husband read that clause twice. Then he set the paper down very gently, like it had insulted him. 7 years, he said. "That was your father's wish," Mr. Pruitt said. "Your father," my sister said to me, "wasn't in his right mind at the end. We both know that. He was confused. He was on all that pain medication." She turned to the lawyer with a face she must have practiced in the mirror. "We'll be contacting our own attorney about undue influence." She was out here alone with him for months. I'd been at his bedside, is what she meant. I'd left my whole life to come home and change his sheets and feed him broth with a spoon while she sent flowers and excuses from 4 hours away. And now, that was going to be the weapon. Old Mr. Pruitt closed his briefcase very slowly. He looked at my sister for a long moment, and then he looked at me. And there was something in his face I'd learned to recognize over the next few months. Something between pity and a warning. Della, he said quietly, I'd start keeping a record of everything. Every call, every visit, dates and times, just in case. Then he gathered his coat and left, and the second the door clicked shut behind him, the masks came all the way off. My brother-in-law leaned across the table. You think you're going to keep us out of what's ours, he said, because you put on a uniform and played hero for a few years? You're a glorified ambulance driver, Della. I'm the one who built something. We are getting that money, and you are going to make it easy on yourself. I'd dragged men twice my size out of burning vehicles. I'd held a 19-year-old's heart going while the birds shook around me. I wasn't afraid of him, but I looked at my sister sitting there beside him, not saying a word, just watching me with those flat eyes. And what I felt wasn't fear. It was grief. A second funeral. Right there at the kitchen table. For a sister I suddenly understood I'd already lost. If you've ever had to fight a war nobody warned you was coming, one that started right inside your own family, do me a favor and type the word Honer down in the comments. Because that's the only thing I had left to fight for, and some nights it was the only thing that got me out of bed. I did what Mr. Pruitt told me. I started a log, and then I called the one man I knew would understand exactly what I was up against, because he'd spent 30 years watching good families come apart over land and money in that very county. Wade Tillman answered on the second ring. I told him everything, and there was a long silence on the line, and then he said, Della, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't you do a thing till I get there. It took him 15. He pulled up in the same dented old Ford he'd been driving since I was a kid, and he climbed out slow the way old cowboys do, all hips and grimace, and he had a toolbox in one hand and his wife Glenna's foil-covered casserole in the other. Wade wasn't sheriff anymore, hadn't been for years, but he carried himself like the badge had grown into his skin. He walked the whole property with me as the light went down, checking every door and window latch, and the whole time he talked low and steady, the way you talk to a spooked horse. Your daddy built this place for a family, he said, testing the slider on the back porch. Not to defend it, there's no thought to it. A man comes at you out here, nobody's hearing it but the coyotes. He stopped at the big barn doors, the ones that didn't even have a real lock, just a wooden bar, and he shook his head. First thing tomorrow, we're putting deadbolts on, and I'm getting you cameras. The little kind. You mount one over the barn aisle, one on the porch, one on the drive. He looked at me hard in the failing light. I made your father a promise a long time ago. Told him if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after his girls. His jaw worked. I feel like I already failed one of them. I'm not failing you. We sat at the kitchen table after, and Glenna's chicken and dumplings broke something loose in me that I'd been holding clenched since the funeral, and I cried into my plate like a child. And Wade didn't say a word. He just let me. When I was done, he told me stories about my dad I'd never heard. The time the two of them got their truck stuck in the river crossing and had to walk 8 miles back in their wet boots. The year Dad helped him re-roof his place after a hailstorm and refused so much as a beer for it. Your daddy was the most decent man I ever knew, he said. And what these two are doing to his name. He stopped, and his hands were shaking, and he set down his fork. You let them dig their own hole, Della. You document everything. You stay inside the law, and you let me know the minute that black truck of his comes up your drive. I'm your backup now. You call, I come. That's how it works. For about a week, I let myself believe it might be over. The calls had started by then, the 3 a.m. Ones where nobody spoke, just breathed, then hung up. Wade had me writing everyone down. The number was always blocked, but the timestamps built a wall of their own. Then the calls stopped, and the truck stopped rolling past my gate at midnight, and a small, foolish part of me started to hope they'd gotten their fill. Then my sister called, and her voice was the old voice. The one from before, soft and a little broken, and so much like the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms that it knocked the air out of me. Della, she said, I've been thinking about Dad. About all of it. I think we let it get so ugly so fast, and I don't even know how. A pause. A little catch in her throat that I wanted so badly to believe. Can we just talk? You and me. The Bluebird, like when we were kids, just us. The Bluebird Cafe. Miss Dot's Pancakes. The booth in the corner where Dad used to take us for hot chocolate after a cold morning of chores. Every cell in my body that had survived 2 deployments was screaming at me that this was an ambush, and I went anyway because she was my sister and because some door in my heart hadn't finished closing yet. I knew the second I walked in, she wasn't in the corner booth alone. Her husband was beside her, and there was a third chair pulled up and a man I didn't recognize in a gray suit with a leather folio, and the whole thing had the staged, breathless feel of a room that had been waiting for me. Half the cafe was people I'd known my whole life. Old Mr. Puzz, Abernathy, who'd taught me 8th grade history, was 2 booths over with his coffee. Miss Dot was frozen behind the counter with a worried frown. My sister started before I'd even sat down, and her voice was pitched just loud enough to carry. Della, honey, I'm so glad you came. We're all so worried about you. She reached across the table like she wanted to take my hand, performing it for the room. I know how hard things have been. The war, and then losing Dad on top of it. Sometimes when a person's been through that much trauma, they don't even realize they're not thinking straight. The man in the gray suit, it turned out, was some kind of mediator her husband had hired, there to help the family find a resolution. But that wasn't the play. The play was the audience. You've been out there all alone, my sister went on, sorrowful, gentle, knifing me in front of the whole town. Talking to Dad's pictures. Not sleeping. Della, PTSD is real, nobody's blaming you. But you cannot keep clinging to that ranch and pushing away the people who love you. You need help. You need that money for treatment more than anything. She'd taken the proudest thing I owned, the years I'd spent keeping other people's children alive, and she'd sharpened it into a tool to make me look insane. In front of my 8th grade teacher, in front of Miss Dot, her husband sat back with his arms folded and the faintest smile on his face, watching me the way you watch a trap you're sure has already sprung. I'll tell you what I learned in the service that those two never understood. You don't have to win every fight in the room you're standing in. Sometimes you just have to refuse to lose yourself. I stood up slow. I put my hands flat on the table so they could see they weren't shaking. And I looked at my sister, at the stranger wearing her face, and I said, quietly enough that she had to lean in to hear it, I sat with him every single night while you sent flowers. I know exactly what I am. The question is whether you do. Then I looked at her husband. And you don't know the first thing about war, but you're about to learn something about people who've been to one. I left $2 on the table for a coffee I never ordered, and I walked out with my back straight and my eyes dry, and I did not look back, even though I could feel every stare in that cafe burning into me like a brand. I drove home and I stood in front of the picture of my father in his dress greens, the one from his retirement, and I finally let myself cry the way I'd needed to since the funeral. I tried to do it your way, I told him. I tried to be quiet and dignified about it. I wiped my face on my sleeve. I can't anymore, Dad. I'm sorry. 2 days later, they came to the ranch. I'd known it was coming. There's a kind of stillness in the air before a thing goes bad, and I'd lived inside that stillness for years. I'd called Wade that morning just to tell him I had a feeling, and he told me to keep my phone in my hand and the cameras running. I'd done one more thing, too. The kind of thing 6 years of habit makes automatic. I'd clipped a small recorder inside my jacket. I wanted a record in case it came down to my word against theirs. The black truck came up my drive a little after 10, and my heart didn't jump. It dropped into that cold, slow rhythm I knew from the worst days of my life. I sent Wade a single word. Now. Then I walked out to meet them in the open instead of letting them corner me in the house, and I made the mistake of letting them get close. My brother-in-law had a sheaf of papers in his fist. Some document his lawyer had cooked up, a refinance, a mortgage against the ranch with the cash going straight to them. You're signing this today, he said, or so help me God I will make sure there's nothing left of this place for you to be so proud of. No, I said. That one word lit him up like a struck match. Everything he'd ever felt about himself, every failure he'd blamed on everyone but the man in the mirror, came out of him at once. He came at me, and I shifted to put the hitching post between us, and I was raising my hands the way I'd been trained. But I'll be honest with you, there was a piece of me, a stupid, soft, little sister piece, that still couldn't quite believe a man my sister loved was really going to do it. That half second of disbelief was all he needed. He drove his shoulder into me, and we went down into the barn dirt together, and my head caught the edge of the post on the way, and the world went white and ringing. Then his weight was on me, and the fists started, and these were not the fists of a brawler. They were the desperate, sloppy, endless fists of a man who'd already decided how this had to end. I felt a rib go with a sound I felt more than heard. I tasted copper. I clawed at his face and got nothing. My vision started to tunnel down to a gray pinhole, and through it I saw him roll off me, and for one wild second I thought I'd won. And then I saw him reach for the shelf by the tack room where my father kept the bronze. It was a sculpture. A cavalry rider on a rearing horse, heavy cast bronze, the trophy my father had been given the year he retired. The thing he loved more than any object he owned, because it was honor made solid, the work of his whole life pressed into metal. My brother-in-law lifted it over his head with both hands, and his chest was heaving, and I knew, the way you know things at the bottom of your life, that he was going to bring my father's honor down on my skull and end me with it. I looked past him to the barn doors. My sister was standing there, not screaming, not running for help. Her arms were crossed and her face was perfectly, horribly still, the face of a woman watching something mildly inconvenient finish itself up. And then she spoke, in a voice as flat and clear as a bell on a cold morning, and those words are carved into the inside of my skull for as long as I live. "Just finish it, Royce. She's not signing anything anyway." The bronze started down, and the barn doors slammed open so hard one of them tore half off its track, and there was Wade Tillman, 68 years old and moving like a man half that, his old service revolver up in a steady two-hand grip, leveled square at my brother-in-law's chest. "Drop it," Wade said. "Now. On the ground, both of you." I don't remember much after that. I remember the bronze hitting the dirt next to my head. I remember red and blue light washing over the barn rafters. I remember Wade's hand, dry and warm and shaking, pressed against the side of my head while he talked to me low and steady, telling me to stay with him. "Captain, stay right here," just like he'd say to a horse, and me trying to tell him I wasn't a captain, I was just a medic, and not being able to make the words come out. I came back to myself 2 days later in a hospital bed in Billings with 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that made the ceiling spin, and a line of staples in my scalp. Wade was asleep in the chair beside me, gray and folded up small, and when I shifted he came awake instantly and his whole face cracked open with relief. "Hey," he said. "There she is." The first thing out of my mouth before anything was, "The cameras." He pulled out his phone and held it up like it was something holy. "Got every second, Della. Audio and all. They're both in county lockup. And Calvin's already filing." He leaned close. "You just heal up. The fighting part's mine and his now." But it wasn't, not really. Because the morning after I could sit up, I asked the nurse for a legal pad, and I started doing the only thing I've ever known how to do when the world goes to pieces. I built a timeline, same as any after-action report I'd ever filed, except this one started at a funeral. Every call, every drive-by, every lie they'd whispered to our cousins, the staged ambush at the Bluebird, the threats, the dates and times I'd been logging since the day Mr. Pruitt told me to, 9 pages in handwriting that got steadier as I went. When I handed it to Calvin Pruitt, he read it without a word, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet and hard at the same time. "Della," he said, "this isn't a he said, she said anymore. You documented a campaign. They cannot tell a jury this was some heat-of-the-moment thing. You've proved they planned it." And the rest of it came out, the way these things do once somebody starts pulling the thread. Wade called in an old favor and they subpoenaed my brother-in-law's finances, and the picture that came back was uglier than I'd let myself imagine. The man was hollowed out by debt, gambling mostly, dressed up as investments, along with a stack of loans he'd taken against clients' accounts that crossed a line into fraud. He and my sister weren't just greedy. They were drowning. They needed the cash from that ranch the way a man underwater needs air, and somewhere in their drowning, they decided that my life was a smaller thing than their comfort. When the police had searched his truck after the arrest, they'd found a duffel in the back. Passport, cash, clothes. He'd packed to run the second he had the money in hand. I wore my dress uniform to the trial. I want to tell you it was a strategy, and it was. I wanted the 12 people in that jury box, and the judge, and most of all the 2 people at the defense table, to see exactly who they had decided to put down for good in a barn. Not a confused, broken veteran clinging to her dead daddy's dirt. A soldier. But it was more than strategy. It was the truth of me, and I had earned every ribbon on that chest. And I was done letting anyone tell the room I was something less. My brother-in-law looked like a ghost when I walked in. All the swagger boiled off him. My sister had traded her designer coat for a plain gray suit some lawyer had told her to wear, and she spent the whole trial trying to catch my eye with a face full of practiced sorrow. I never once gave it to her. In my mind, she had already become a stranger, and you don't owe a stranger your forgiveness on a schedule. On the stand, I didn't cry and I didn't perform. I walked the jury through the timeline the same way I'd brief a mission, flat and clear and undeniable. The prosecutor put my text messages up on the big screen, the threats in black and white, played the 3 a.m. calls, and when the defense attorney stood up and tried to do to me what my sister had done at the Bluebird, asking me with that oily false gentleness whether combat veterans don't often suffer from paranoia, aggression, memory loss, I turned in the chair and looked straight at the jury and said, "My service taught me how to keep people alive under fire. It did not teach me to imagine my own brother-in-law trying to kill me. I didn't have to imagine it. You're about to watch it." Then they played the video. The barn footage filled the screen, grainy and gray, and I had to look at the floor while it ran because I couldn't watch myself go down again. I heard the thud of the fists through the courtroom speakers, my own ragged breathing, and then the worst part, my sister's voice coming through clear as anything. "Just finish it, Royce. She's not signing anything anyway." The prosecutor froze the frame right there on her face. Not a panicked wife caught in something out of control. A woman watching, calm, waiting. He let the silence sit. A juror in the back row, a heavy-set man with a faded eagle, globe, and anchor tattooed on his forearm, put his hand over his mouth and slowly shook his head. A younger woman 2 seats down was crying without making a sound. The jury was out less than 90 minutes. Guilty. On every count. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, conspiracy, solicitation. My brother-in-law folded forward over the table like his strings had been cut. My sister just stared at nothing. The last mask finally gone and nothing underneath it I recognized. When the judge handed down the sentences, long ones, real ones, he took off his glasses and looked at the two of them with a cold, level anger I'll never forget. "You did not merely attack your sister," he said. "You weaponized her service. You defiled the memory of a decorated soldier in the home he built with his own hands. You are a disgrace to the word family." Then they led them out in handcuffs, and I waited to feel triumphant, and I didn't. I just felt the weight of 2 years come off me all at once, and underneath it, a tiredness that went all the way to the bone. People ask me sometimes if I've forgiven her. My own sister. I've thought about it more than I've thought about anything else. And here's the most honest answer I have. Forgiveness, the way most folks mean it, is a door you open so the other person can walk back into your life. I'm not opening that door, and I've made my peace with that. What I've done instead is set the whole thing down. I stopped carrying her in my chest like an open wound I had to keep checking. I let her be exactly what she chose to be, and I let myself stop bleeding over it. That's not forgiveness, it's something quieter, and for me, it was enough. The town came for me after the trial, the same way they'd failed to before. They believed her poisoned for a while, a lot of them, and they knew it, and they showed up at my gate one Saturday in a convoy of pickups and minivans without being asked. Miss Dot at the front of the line with a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher. They re-roofed the barn my father had let go soft. They painted the whole thing, repaired the fences, mucked out years of neglect. Nobody made a speech. Old Mr. Menada, Abernathy, who'd sat there silent in that cafe while my sister carved me up, climbed up on the roof at 70 years old with a nail gun and worked till dark. And when he came down, he just gripped my shoulder and said, "Your father'd be proud, Della. We should have stood up sooner." I told him it was all right. It wasn't. Not all the way. But I was learning that you can let something not be all right and still let people back in. I didn't sell the ranch. For a while I thought I would. Just to be free of the ghosts in that barn. But sitting out on the porch one cold blue morning with my hands around a coffee gone cold, watching my father's horses breathe steam into the air, I understood what he'd built and what he'd handed me. He didn't leave me 200 acres of dirt and debt, no matter what they'd called it. He left me a place where broken people could come and put their hands on something living and slowly remember they were still in there somewhere. So I made it official. I used everything I had and I started the Hollis Ramsey Stable Ground Project, a little nonprofit running free equine therapy out of my father's barn for veterans and their families, men and women who'd walked through the same fire I had, who carried it home in the set of their shoulders, Come out to Cottonwood Road now and learn to groom and to lead and to just be quiet alongside a 1,000-pound animal that doesn't need them to explain a thing. It does for them what it did for me. It does what no doctor's office ever managed. This story doesn't really end, but if I had to pick a place to leave you, it'd be a Saturday morning a few springs later. The Montana lake coming gold and long across the arena. The smell of hay and horse and cold mud in the air. I'm standing next to a young Marine named Tobias, who hadn't slept a full night since he came home from his last deployment, showing him how to pick a hoof without spooking the mare. And he's laughing. Just a little. A real one. Surprised out of him? The kind his wife later told me with tears running down her face she hadn't seen since before he shipped out. Around the arena, there's a Navy corpsman teaching an old Vietnam vet to throw a saddle, and a soldier who lost a leg outside Kandahar learning to ride again. The whole place humming with people who walk through hell and are finding their way back one quiet morning at a time. We have a creed in the Army. 4 lines drilled into you until they're part of your spine, and the last one is the one I carry. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I used to think that ended when you took off the uniform. I know better now. Our comrades are everywhere, fighting wars in the silence of their own kitchens, and you don't get to walk away from them just because the shooting stopped. My father knew that long before I did. He left me his land, but his land was never the legacy. His legacy is right here, in these healing hands, in these slow returning smiles, in a barn that almost became the place I died and instead became the place 100 people learned to live. My fortress was never made of wood and wire. The strongest walls I own are the ones I had to build inside myself, out of honor and grief and stubborn hope, and no one, not even my own blood, was ever strong enough to bring them down.